So, again, just to summarize and put this in context, what the PIP did was it took a real-world, very difficult situation in which we were balancing two values which I think are very weighty and important and not in competition with each other, but had to be reconciled. This took 4 years of formal negotiations. It took another year of informal negotiations, which really preceded the formal negotiations, and it cost a lot of money, and it required hundreds, if not thousands, of people to be involved in coming into these meetings. And but as a result of this, it developed a solution which in many ways was solid. Countries, member states across the board were quite happy with the solution. I've never been in a room at WHO when there was as much, I think, genuine just euphoria that an agreement had been reached at that 6 o'clock in the morning. Secondly, the groups which are also very important to take into account, civil society, which had been monitoring this discussion and really involved in a substantive way, also found the solution to be really quite balanced and fair and a strong advocate for the PIP framework. But as Anne mentioned, that framework faces several different challenges. One, it only covers pandemic potential viruses, influenza viruses. It does not cover seasonal flu viruses. It certainly does not cover virus X. The second issue is that, as Anne mentioned, science has moved on. GS sequence data is routine, and the switching over from viruses to sequence data is, a common occurrence which is happening across the board, and it has very real implications. But this mechanism, which took so much time to carve out, has in fact created a reservoir of vaccine, a reservoir of antiviral drugs, and money going into the public health system to work on laboratories and build infrastructure out there, which we've acknowledged is critical for national capacity. Those things have been very real results of all of this, and they are now basically at risk. And there is a very difficult question, and there has been now for a while a growing debate about what to do. And so this is where we are right now, what to do. And so, before I throw it open to the audience, to all of you for the questions, I do want to turn to the panel and ask you the same question. Do you think that this model that we went through to negotiate the PIP framework, and do you think the PIP framework as it now stands is a model that we're going to be able to use moving into the future, or do you see that this is not possible? And so it's a somewhat general question, but I'll open it to all of you.
I think the one that has been concluded in Geneva in the form of PIP is very unique. I had been experienced negotiation in a number of issues. It's usually these issues among the representative government, or it is among the representative government and the private sector. But in discussing the PIP framework, all stakeholders are involved in it actively, day and night during the negotiation. And then eventually, something that was seen impossible to have consensus on it, eventually it is actually reached adaptable solutions that are acceptable to all. Not only the government, but also the civil society, private sectors, even private sector contributing to the resources, and also stockpile of this one. So I think this is a new model of the international relations in terms of addressing the global challenge.
I agree that it's a new model, and when I look at some governments, including the United States government, it is very, very difficult to get the United States Senate to approve a new treaty. The beauty of the PIP framework is that it's not a treaty. As we heard, it's a resolution that was passed by the World Health Assembly, but then what it ends up being is a standard materials transfer agreement and a contract. And that has worked. So I think the model that creates, and I've had people actually ask me about this, can it be used for other things? I don't know exactly what other issues are out there, but it may be useful as a model for other ways to get the international cooperation that is needed without having to go through what can be a cumbersome and sometimes self-defeating treaty process.
Thanks, KG. I think it's a very important question about whether the model, particularly the process model, is the right one. It may be that we can't avoid that process model if ultimately we are looking for legitimacy and credibility, because the components of legitimacy and credibility take time. And those components are transparency, inclusiveness, and broad understanding. Broad understanding means you have to bring up to speed all those different stakeholders. So we moved from discussions at the very beginning, mostly with ministries of health. We had to bring in ministries of foreign affairs. When we're talking about Nagoya, which brings in other ministries, ministries of agriculture, ministries of environment, that will make for an even longer process. But again, given the importance of trust and equity, having a legitimate and credible product is going to require those investments, which can only be really purchased with time. There may be ways to improve the speed for the WHO as a secretariat in the capacity of the Director General, for example, to make proposals, particularly when it comes to other pathogens, when it comes to seasonal influenza, but it will really be member states that ultimately have to decide, and that will be through the established mechanisms of the World Health Organization.
So I think it's probably a mix of the two. So a model as well as something that's going to be difficult to follow. But, flu is really a unique microcosm of mutually supporting interests. Governments need vaccine to protect their people. Countries need to share their viruses in order to have good vaccine. And industry needs to make the vaccine, and it derives some revenue from that. But this is a disease that is recognized by many countries as extremely important for their public health systems. There's a vaccine, and there's a market that's willing to pay. That's often hard to find in emerging diseases. So the thing about PIP that is replicable and that we can learn lessons from probably are the core principles. So equal footing was mentioned by UKG. That was the log jam, that was the thing that broke the log jam and really enabled the negotiations to move forward, the equal footing of virus sharing and benefit sharing. Also the principle of benefit sharing according to the nature and the capacity of the entities that are required to provide benefits. That's a very important principle. The ambassador from Norway had this famous phrase, PIP is not in the business of putting business out of business. And she was very strong about this, saying we have to keep equity in mind and make sure that this is not some system to take advantage of things, but it should be fair and equitable. So that's another principle that can govern. Transparency and partnership, as Steve has mentioned, are also very important. One other thing that can be thought of, flu is really the poster child for capacity building and for, building capacities to prepare for a health emergency. So we can use some of the platforms from seasonal influenza, pandemic preparedness, to replicate some of the the mechanisms that we have. So, start.
Thanks, Anne. So the floor is open. Questions, anybody? Sir.
Thank you. First, thank you so much to all the panelists and KG2 for organizing this discussion. It's a super fascinating and very candid set of remarks from people who were clearly very close to and perhaps a bit traumatized by a 4-year negotiation experience. But I think you should all be very pleased with the outcome because you took 4 years to build a plane, but it flew at the end of the day. And I think that's not something we see all the time. My question is about the debate around non-influenza pathogens. And I just wonder, will it take, the PIP framework was clearly negotiated in response to a political crisis. And I'm wondering, will it take another crisis for there to be kind of a kickstart to address the same issues that come up over and over again, but not related to influenza? Or are we in a okay position right now? Is it not urgent to have any further frameworks developed? So I guess there's really two questions there that maybe I'll just try to articulate them a little bit more neatly. The first is, do we need anything else beyond influenza? And if we do, what will it take to get a bit of that political startup energy, particularly given how challenging negotiation of the last framework was?
Why don't we take a couple questions, we'll batch them, or maybe take 2 or 3 questions at a time. Yes.
So actually, it's a little bit related, but again, thank you. It's fascinating to see in that, I say behind closed doors, but into that boardroom. And it's a great story at the end of the game, but I'm also concerned by the discussion of this, the genomic sequences, or GS, or one of your acronyms, where now suddenly it kind of pulls the rug out from under, potentially. So if it's like now you can't, say, force industry to sign the contract because of the technicality, where it's no longer biological material but genomic sequence derived from biological material. Is that being taken at that technical word, or is there enough feeling of, okay, that it's able to negotiate this, and this, of course, globally was supposed to include that. It's just that now we're in, a couple years later and a new technology, et cetera. So, are you concerned about the issues that the GS or GM and what GR brings to the table, or is this something that the PIP and the agreement is going to be able to override this? Or I'm just curious.
Okay. Great. Do we have a related question yet, Peter? And then we'll turn to the panel.
Very related to the last question, really specifically on the genetic sequence aspect. We're in a world where you can reverse engineer a whole virus fairly easily for some viral families. How are you going to deal with that from a legal perspective? If you go down this line of a genetic sequence becomes the biological product that you're talking about sharing benefits from, once it becomes public, you could tweak, one base pair, and you've got a different, essentially different organism. It creates a whole series of problems. I wonder how you're going to deal with that.
Okay, thanks. So first to the double question, do we need anything else, a new framework for non-influenza pathogens, and what will it take to get started? So here would be my answers very briefly. Do we need anything else for non-influenza pathogens, a new framework? Answer, yes. What will it take to get started? A crisis. Unless there is a general enlightened self-interest among member states who understand this problem, who understand the imperative of sharing, the global health benefit that comes from rapid sharing, and There is an understanding that benefits cannot be, it won't work on a bilateral basis, that you need a multilateral regime to allow for benefits. And PIP is a multilateral regime. There are no benefits which flow to specific countries which put a virus into GISRIS. They don't get a particular something back for that. What they get, what the ministers get, is the confidence that they can tell their cabinet and their people that when the pandemic comes, there should be 400 million doses that WHO will distribute, and they get to say, we will also get a revenue stream from WHO to build our country's capacity. So that's what they get. Something along those lines needs to apply to all pathogens, particularly in the near term, pathogens that pose threats under the IHR. Do you want to add on to that before we go to JCPSD?
Just before you even get to the non-flu pathogens, you have to deal with seasonal and Nagoya. And I think Jackie is here. She probably understands it better than anyone. But there is nothing covering seasonal influenza viruses at this point because PIP does not cover them. So what do we do with seasonal? And what will it take to get something that addresses the sharing of seasonal viruses on this is routine sharing for a seasonal program, seasonal vaccine development. But it is becoming a crisis because we have had instances where some viruses have not made it to the vaccine composition meetings in time to be considered. So if it's just one country or two countries, one instance or two, that's one thing. But if this becomes regular practice, as Nagoya becomes more implemented in 110, 150 countries, what's going to happen to the seasonal sharing system? So we don't even have to go to the all pathogen realm yet. We're right there for seasonal influenza.
So, and I will say that when we are asked by health ministries about Nagoya, the question that comes up is, show us the problem. Where is the problem today with pathogen sharing? And there is increasing evidence that there is a emerging problem with seasonal influenza. But the evidence for a current problem with respect to other pathogens is not so clear. There are problems in the sharing of other pathogens, but nothing yet that can have the impact. But again, this is why I speak of the issue of enlightened self-interest. When there's greater understanding about the potential here and the importance of this issue, it is possible that something can be started prior to a crisis.
I'd like to pick up on Swari's question and just give kind of a general comment. The theme of this workshop is exploring lessons learned since the 1918 influenza pandemic. When I look back on my 3 years as the State Department's Special Representative on Avian and Pandemic Influenza, one of my regrets is that we didn't do more institution building. Separate from the PIP framework, which clearly ended up being a success, we were so focused on the immediate, and we had meetings with 100 ministers of health or agriculture coming to Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, for example, to talk about the threat from avian and pandemic influenza. But in the end, we weren't so focused on capacity building in countries that would leave a more permanent mark. And I regretted that, and really the interest in this went down. The Global Health Security Agenda, a U.S. government initiative that WHO, FAO, OIE, and now 65 countries have signed up for, was announced in February of 2014, but it really didn't have a lot of money behind it until Ebola came. And this gets back to what Swari was saying about a crisis really brings things to the fore. And there was some question in December of 2016. I remember going to a big meeting with Secretary of State Kerry and the National Security Advisor and the USAID Administrator, how important the Global Health Security Agenda was to be continued in the next administration. And yes, what happened was the Trump administration has made this a major effort. And Ambassador Wibisono and I were in Bali, Indonesia earlier this month at the Global Health Security Agenda Ministerial Meeting. The Secretary of Health and Human Services of the U.S. Was there via video, and the Deputy Secretary was present for the entire meeting. There's now that higher level of engagement. And global health security, if you want to, you don't have to think of it in terms of GHSA, but small g, small h, small s, encompasses pandemic preparedness, but also things such as antimicrobial resistance and the need for higher levels of immunizations, because that saves so many lives, including in a pandemic, if you have high levels of routine immunization, a creation of emergency operations centers, et cetera. So while I really appreciate the focus of this particular workshop on pandemics, I think we're better off riding the wave as best we can, this wave of interest in global health security that came out of Ebola, because that is what is better able to capture the interests at the political level and at the level of the appropriators in Congresses and parliaments.
Yeah, ma'am. With regard to the seasonal influenza, actually the PIP supported by Gavi make such kind like a project to expand the capacity of countries to produce the seasonal vaccine. Yeah, for example, when the outbreak in Indonesia, we didn't have capacity at all to produce the vaccine, but right now we do have capacity to produce it. So meaning that the capacity of producing the seasonal executive increasing, therefore the availability of the seasonal vaccines are actually better than pandemic vaccine. Secondly, with regard to what can generate this new form, yeah, I will make an analogy with the natural disaster. When the natural disaster come to Palu, yeah, and Lombok Island, you know, a lot of attention from the politician, a lot of donation from the private sectors, you know, come in. Yeah. But once the situation is actually mitigated and there is a process of construction need money, yeah, to construct houses, nobody come. Because why? You know, when there is a problem of natural disaster, every day newspaper cover that, TV cover that, yeah. But if it is over, and then the appetite to contribute is becoming less and less and less. This is the reality that we are facing.
I think overall there is a problem in recognition of the importance of seasonal influenza in a good part of the world. And until that becomes resolved, we're really not going to have the pressure from many of the member states of WHO to work on a PIP framework for seasonal vaccines. Not only that, we will never have sufficient vaccines for a pandemic if we don't have seasonal production of influenza vaccines. And I think this needs to be addressed in novel ways. We've been thinking about probe studies and doing a variety of things in order to dramatically address this in terms of what the ministers of health see as the benefits of influenza vaccines. As we move to improved vaccines, I think that's something that should be high on the priority list.
Other questions or observations or comments? Let me maybe make a comment at this point and so on, because I think that for me, I think the issue raised by Nagoya and genetic sequences is the first question is what actually is the issue? What does it raise and what is the actual concern? And I think that if you ask that question, is this an issue, is this a legal issue? Is this a conceptual issue? Is this an issue of perspectives? You know, Nagoya was developed with an environmental perspective in mind. PIP framework was developed with more or less a public health perspective in mind. Is this an issue of trust? I mean, that 4 years of negotiations was really an effort to identify where is there mistrust, how do you deal with it, and then how do you come up with something which can solve that. And then when you add something like genetic sequences in, part of the issue is, you know, Peter, I don't know how to answer your question right now, but I think that how do you track genetic sequences? You know, how do you know things are moving around? How do you adapt to the changing technologies and information out there? And the difficulty is that all of these things are being raised at the same time. But I think there is a fundamental issue of trust and distrust which underlies the whole thing. And the PIP was considered successful because everybody who participated in, and I should have mentioned industry, because industry was absolutely instrumental in reaching a final agreement, that these new developments really, in all of our minds, raise the idea that that distrust has not disappeared. It's been handled, it's been contained, but it is still there. And so letting that loose again is not something that we all want to see in this area. But I think this is what we're confronted. But I agree with my colleagues here that there is, in essence, a crisis which is developing. Every time we have a new pathogen which is identified, which is potentially dangerous, the same questions come up. You know, who owns this virus? What's going to happen to it? What do we need to agree upon? Do we need some kind of consent? Is this a PI to PI agreement that I send you this, and is that good enough in a context when the world is worried about things and countries are involved? And it's a really messy group of issues, but again, it is the reality of things out there. So I also believe that we are going to probably need to go through some kind of long process again. I think it is unavoidable. But the problem with that and the difficulty is that is partly this is raised by changing technologies. I mean, we talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about big data, we understand that we are in the midst of a technical transition that we can't even begin to comprehend all of those things, but somehow they do impact in these areas. And so this is why the deliberations are very difficult, and you know, I, like everybody else, I'll be quite keen to see how they go at the global level. I think this will be addressed at the next Health Assembly, and so we will see how countries decide to take this forward. So are there other questions for the panel? Okay, well, we ran a little bit late, and now I think we're a little bit early. So that's always kind of a victory. So first, Ceci and Ayano, are there any issues to raise before we close down?